Well, we have a few minutes left, so why don't you take a couple of questions, and I'll just ask the panel to comment on them. So we're really tight for time. So please make your remarks really, really short, okay? So let's, let's start on this side. Over there, please. Yes.
Thank you very much, and thank the panelists for the angles of institutions. But one aspect I didn't hear was about administration and management of institutions, because quite often this is missed out. We invest in the experts and so on in the institutions, but we forget the management of it. What's your take on that?
Thank you. That was really short. Sadiq.
Mine will be short too, because you have reminded us of the shortage of time. Anyway, when we talk about capacity building, what kind of capacity are we talking about? For me, my mantra in this meeting has been, as long as we don't concentrate on capacity building that is aimed at strengthening, empowering the national system. I mean, until such time that we have the national capacity, the homegrown kind of vision for Africa, then we are not going to be going very far. So our capacity building should be geared towards enabling the recipients to be able to build their own capacity, because projects are not there forever, and we can not always depend on projects to build capacity. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me go on this side, just down there. Really quick.
Yes, just a general thought-provoking question. There are so many institutions, organizations working on the same subject matter, quality work. My problem is, who coordinate them? How do you get the focus that would make it work and would really make a difference? Because we run the risk of having a whole mesh of confusion with good information. I think the last speaker alluded to something that is probably, this is the only panel that I probably can throw this question to. So I would like some suggestion on that topic.
Okay. I see one hand that has been up all the time, so you must be.
So I was going to make, I think those were excellent presentations. Just two quick comments, slightly contradictory. I mean, on the one hand, I'd endorse this point about homegrown capacity. I think one of the things that we've lost, that donors lost sight of over the last 30, 40 years, is actually supporting universities in developing countries. I mean, I think there was a brief moment in the 60s and 70s when we did it, and then we all thought primary education, and we stopped giving support to that. And I think the more we can build capacity in national universities, the better. Slightly against that, I agree there's a valuable role for universities and academics, but I think the challenge for those of us involved in policy and programming is the turnaround time. You know, the kind of turnaround time to do academic research, get it peer reviewed, get it out in a journal, it's a little bit slow for us. You know, we want something within 12 months. So that, I think, is one of the tensions between the applied and the purely academic research.
Any lady over there? Yes, because all men talking.
Yeah, I'd just like to follow up on the point about capacity building. I find it interesting for Sean in particular, CRS's discussion about how you're moving towards a kind of a core curriculum, a more centralized and standardized. And I just wanted to know kind of how that pairs with the discussion about local capacity. And a lot of the conversation about resilience has gone on the last few days has been sort of resilience to what, and really looking very contextually at what the conditions are to create that sort of analysis behind resilience. So I find it kind of an interesting dichotomy and wondered if you would kind of talk to that.
Anyone? Okay, right at the end.
Thank you for a very dynamic panel. Two questions, one to Lauren, and the consideration of academia being this hotbed of integrative thinking and allowing integrative thinking. I ask where you're drawing your experiences from. in the atmosphere of low resources, we are finding less and less support for, in the academic setting, and maybe I'm speaking in the Western context, but in the academic setting for integrative work. Though it is served mouthpiece, the action, it's very hard to pull together funding for it. So if you could just illuminate a bit. Secondly, we heard in this morning's plenary about data. And again, our panelist was talking from a statistical point of view. May I try and stitch a few things together in a question of data is there. We heard this morning that we need gender disaggregated data. We heard that it's not being disaggregated by gender. And are we risking by keeping to do new surveys, actually missing the opportunity of understanding baselines that are sitting untouched and unanalyzed?
Okay, I think let's take these questions, and I think most of the questions were around academic issues. So I think Lauren, probably you can start off.
I will start.
Addressing some of those.
I'll start with the easier ones first. I'll get to my friend in the corner on the funding last. On this question about a mess of confusion with good information, I think that's what we often have. I think we have that right now. I don't think there's necessarily a shortage of information or a shortage of data. There is a great shortage of ability to interpret it, to translate it, to use those data. So it is imperfect. Everything's imperfect. We live in an imperfect world. But there are places, and I think that academic institutions, which can be a range of things. They can, of course, be universities, but they can also be academies, like where I work. They can also be think tanks kind of places. So the academic institution, I want you to broaden your thinking and what we're talking about when we say that. But this is where we get to longitudinal research, long-term data sets, where the short term does kind of give us this confusion. But if we take the time, and we've heard over and over again these last few days, this is a long-term undertaking, right? And so as we collect those data, as we share our information, qualitative and quantitative, we need the longitudinal evaluation and analysis of those. And I think that certain types of academic institutions are very good repositories for those data that can then be accessed by a range of people who might want to use it for policy or academic purposes. That was one, and then they'll go...
Curriculum.
What's that?
On the curriculum, I think that's the core curriculum.
That was for Sean.
Oh. I thought it was more on the universities. Do you want to agree with that?
Did you finish yours?
What's that? The core curriculum on the CRS.
Do you want me to do that?
Either way. You want me to
Okay,
finish?
go ahead.
But, and then I'll go to this hotbed of integrative thinking. It is spotty. In the West, it's spotty. But I see UN, I see NSF, that's the National Science Foundation in the US. A lot of the federal agencies in the US are funding integrative, multi, and interdisciplinary research. That's one. So that's where some of the funding comes from. And what we're also seeing, and maybe we're in a special perch because we're an academy and we're supposed to be able to synthesize and translate scientific information. But we're also seeing a renaissance in some ways of these centers of excellence at universities. And this is not just in the US, but you see these centers that are focused specifically on getting inter and multidisciplinary approaches to complex problems. And I think that many of them have a policy focus. You know, how do you take the science from all of these smart people and get into a form that can be used? Funding's always a problem. And I know you were the lone hand up for the private sector, so we might come to you for some more funding, but it's always a problem. But from my perch, at least in the U.S., which is a unique kind of perch, I think that a movement towards complex solutions for complex questions is the right way to go.